At my daughter's their 5th wedding anniversary din, I noticed something was wrong before a single word was spoken. The dining room at their suburban Connecticut home looked beautiful in that polished, magazine-perfect way my son-in-law's mother always preferred. Crystal glasses, linen napkins, white roses arranged so precisely they barely looked real. To anyone else, it might have seemed elegant. To me, it felt staged. Cold. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and comment where you're watching from, because what happened that night changed my family forever. My daughter, Emily, stood near the kitchen doorway, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her navy dress. She used to laugh easily, used to fill a room without trying. But that night, her smile looked practiced, fragile. When she reached for the serving tray, I noticed her hand trembling so slightly most people would have missed it. Then Richard, my son-in-law, set down his wineglass a little too hard. "Honestly, Emily," he said, his voice sharp enough to silence the table. "Can you do anything right?" The room froze. Emily quietly apologized, her cheeks flushing as she adjusted his plate. My stomach tightened. Across from me, Patricia, his mother, leaned back in her chair, took a sip of Chardonnay, and actually smiled. "Oh, she'll learn," she said with a little clap of her manicured hands, as though humiliation were part of the meal. Before I could process it, Richard grabbed Emily's wrist. "Hard. Maybe next time," he muttered. "You'll pay attention." The sound of my daughter's bracelet snapping against her skin echoed louder than the soft music playing overhead. And Patricia applauded. Not shocked, not embarrassed. Applauded. I didn't scream. I didn't argue. I simply stood, picked up my purse, walked into the hallway, and made one phone call. They thought I was stepping away to compose myself. They had no idea I was about to end their perfect little performance. The moment I hung up, I stood in my daughter's hallway for 3 full seconds, staring at my reflection in the gold-framed mirror by the coat rack. At 68, I had lived through the slow cancer that took my husband, foreclosure threats in my 30s, and the kind of grief that hollowed you out so deeply even breathing felt optional. But nothing prepared me for hearing another woman applaud while my daughter was humiliated in her own dining room. When I walked back in, no one looked particularly concerned. Richard had already returned to cutting his steak, like grabbing Emily's wrist hard enough to leave red marks was no more significant than adjusting his cufflinks. Patricia dabbed the corners of her mouth delicately with her napkin, her pearl bracelet glinting beneath the chandelier. Emily moved quietly between the table and kitchen, shoulders slightly hunched, as though making herself smaller might somehow keep the peace. I sat down without a word. "Everything all right, Diane?" Patricia asked, her tone dripping with fake sweetness. I gave her the same smile I used to wear at church bake sales when someone brought store-bought pie and claimed it was homemade. "Perfectly fine," I said. Emily avoided my eyes. That hurt almost more than what I'd witnessed. Because mothers know. We know when our children are hiding pain they've rehearsed pretending doesn't exist. As dessert was served, a lemon cake Emily had probably spent hours making, Richard laughed about how sensitive women had become these days. Patricia chuckled. "Young wives need structure," she said. "My generation understood that." I looked at my daughter then. Really looked. The faint bruise near her sleeve. The silence. The careful movements. And suddenly, every canceled holiday, every short phone call, "We're just so busy, Mom," over the last 3 years rearranged itself like puzzle pieces finally locking into place. This wasn't one bad night. This was a pattern. And while they kept eating dessert, smiling like civilized people, I quietly reached into my purse and waited for the knock at the door. The knock came before Emily had even finished clearing the dessert plates. 3 sharp raps at the front door. The kind that silences a room faster than any raised voice ever could. Richard looked up first, irritation flashing across his face. "Are you expecting someone?" "No," Emily said softly, though I noticed her hand trembling as she set down a dessert fork. Patricia frowned, already offended by the interruption. "Honestly, who shows up uninvited during dinner?" I folded my napkin carefully and placed it beside my plate. "I do believe," I said, my voice calm enough to make Patricia's expression tighten, "that would be for you." For the first time that evening, Richard's confidence cracked. When he opened the door, 2 uniformed officers stood on the porch beneath the warm glow of the entryway chandelier. Behind them was a woman in plain clothes holding a small leather folder. "Good evening," one officer said. "We received a welfare concern regarding Mrs. Emily Carter." The color drained from Richard's face. Patricia rose so abruptly her chair nearly tipped over. "This is absurd. There must be some mistake." "But mistakes don't usually arrive with badges." Emily froze near the dining room archway, one hand gripping the edge of the table so tightly I thought it might splinter. "Emily, you're not in trouble. We're here to make sure you're safe." Safe. Such a small word. Such a devastating one when your own daughter looks startled hearing it. Richard laughed then, but it sounded forced. "Hello. This is ridiculous. We had a minor family disagreement." I had heard that phrase before. Minor disagreement. That's what men like him called fear when they wanted it to sound civilized. One officer's gaze dropped briefly to Emily's wrist, to the red mark already darkening beneath the broken bracelet. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "would you like to tell us what happened tonight?" The silence that followed felt endless. Patricia started talking, loudly, defensively, about overreactions, about family business, about how women these days were too dramatic. But for once, no one was listening to her. Because my daughter, my sweet, careful Emily, who had spent years making herself small, finally began to cry. And when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "This," she said, staring at the floor, "was actually one of the better nights." No one moved after Emily said it. Not Richard, not Patricia, not even the officers. It was as if the entire dining room, the crystal glasses, the half-eaten lemon cake, the candlelight Patricia had so proudly arranged, had frozen around that one sentence. This was actually one of the better nights. I felt those words somewhere deeper than heartbreak, deeper than anger, because suddenly, memories I had dismissed over the past 3 years came rushing back with terrifying clarity. The Thanksgiving Emily canceled because Richard wasn't feeling social. Christmas morning when she wore long sleeves indoors, despite the heat from the fireplace. Her habit of glancing at him before answering even the simplest question. The way her bright, effortless laughter had slowly been replaced by careful smiles and exhausted eyes. I had told myself marriage was adjustment, compromise, stress. God help me. I had even believed her excuses. She's clumsy. She bruises easily. We've just been under pressure. I saw it now. Not as isolated moments. As a system. A slow erosion. Patricia had not created it alone, but she had watered it, fed it, sat at the table and taught her son that cruelty could wear a blazer, use the right silverware, and still call it self-respectability. Emily's shoulders shook as the advocate guided her gently to the living room. Richard stepped forward then, his polished voice cracking. "Emily, don't do this. You're overreacting." Overreacting. Such a convenient word when someone finally tells the truth. One officer raised a hand, stopping him. "Sir, step back." For the first time in his carefully managed life, someone had interrupted him. Patricia, of course, couldn't stay silent. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she snapped. "Every marriage has difficult moments. My husband was strict too. I survived." I turned to her then. Really turned. And I realized something cold. Women like Patricia didn't just excuse pain. They inherited it, polished it, and passed it down like family china. "Well," I said quietly, standing straighter than I had all night, "that tradition ends here." Patricia's mouth fell open, but I wasn't speaking to her anymore. I was looking at my daughter. And for the first time in years, Emily looked back at me not like a woman asking permission to endure, but like a little girl finally hoping someone would take her home. Emily didn't need to say another word. The moment she looked at me, that fragile, frightened look beneath years of practiced composure, I knew exactly what had to happen next. "Go get your coat, sweetheart," I said. My voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Something in it must have reached the part of her that still remembered who she was before this house, before this marriage, before she learned to measure every breath against someone else's temper. Richard laughed nervously, but there was an edge to it now. "Oh, come on. Diane, don't be dramatic. We can handle this privately." Privately. That word nearly made me shiver. Private was where bruises got explained away. Private was where cruel men became charming again by morning. Private was where women like Patricia did their best work. "No," I said, standing as Emily slowly nodded and disappeared upstairs with the advocate. "You've handled her privately long enough." Patricia scoffed from beside the china cabinet. "And where exactly do you think she's going? Marriage is hard. She took vows. I looked at that woman, her pearls, her pressed silk blouse, her cold little kingdom built on intimidation, and realized she truly believed endurance was the same thing as dignity. She's going, I said, somewhere safe. Richard's jaw tightened. You can't just take my wife. At that, even one of the officers shifted. Funny how men like him always said my wife when they really meant my control. Emily returned 10 minutes later carrying an overnight bag so small it broke my heart. Just one bag. As though some part of her had always known she might need to leave quickly. As though survival had quietly packed itself long before tonight. When she stepped past Richard, he reached for her arm again. This time, he didn't get the chance. Sir, the officer warned, stepping directly between them. And just like that, Richard, who had dominated every room Emily entered for years, was no longer the most powerful person in it. Outside, the night air felt colder than it should have. Emily climbed into my car like someone crossing a border she never thought she'd escape. As I closed her door, Patricia called from the porch. You're ruining her family. I turned back once, my hand steady on the car frame. No, I said. I'm saving my daughter from yours. Then I got in, locked the doors, and drove my little girl home. The drive back to my house was almost unbearably quiet. Not the peaceful kind of silence I used to enjoy after Sunday church. Not the comforting kind that comes with long marriages and familiar roads. This silence was fragile. Like one wrong word might shatter what little strength Emily had left. She sat in the passenger seat clutching that small overnight bag in her lap, her knuckles pale, her wedding ring catching flashes of passing streetlights. Twice, I saw her reach up like she might wipe away tears, then stop, as though even crying had once required permission. When we finally pulled into my driveway, she hesitated. I recognized that hesitation immediately. It was the look of someone wondering whether they were truly allowed to feel safe. I turned off the engine. You never have to ask to come home, I said softly. That did it. 32 years old, and my daughter broke down like the little girl who used to crawl into my bed after thunderstorms. I held her in my driveway beneath the porch light until her shaking slowed. Inside, I made tea. Chamomile. The same kind my mother used to make for me after heartbreak, because some women pass down survival more usefully than pearls. Emily sat at my kitchen table wrapped in one of my old knitted blankets, staring at the steam rising from her mug. For a long time, she said nothing. Then finally, it wasn't always like this. Of course it wasn't. Cruelty rarely begins with cruelty. It begins with charm, with apologies, with flowers after slammed doors, with mothers like Patricia whispering, marriage takes patience, while teaching women to confuse suffering with loyalty. So I listened, really listened, about the first time he shoved her into a wall and cried afterward. The bank account he insisted should be simplified. The friends she slowly stopped seeing because they disrespected her husband. The passwords he demanded. The insults disguised as jokes. The nights Patricia would call not to help, but to remind Emily that good wives don't provoke tension. By midnight, my tea had gone cold. By 1 a.m., I realized my daughter had not been living in a difficult marriage. She had been surviving an institution built to erase her. And sometime around 2 a.m., while Emily finally slept in her childhood bedroom down the hall, I sat alone at my kitchen table with my reading glasses, a legal pad, and one phone number I hadn't used in years. Sandra Whitmore, the toughest divorce attorney in Fairfield County. Because Richard and Patricia still believed tonight had been an emotional overreaction. They still thought Emily had simply left dinner. They had no idea. By morning, I was going to make sure she never had to go back. Sandra answered at 7:12 the next morning. Not with sympathy, not with shock. Just 4 words that instantly reminded me why women whispered her name like a prayer in Fairfield County. Tell me everything, Diane. By 8 a.m., Emily was still asleep upstairs, curled beneath her faded blue childhood quilt like someone recovering from a war no one had officially declared, while I sat at my kitchen table sliding 20 years of family paperwork into neat little piles. Bank statements, mortgage records, joint accounts, insurance policies, tax returns. I wasn't searching for revenge. I was searching for patterns. And once I started looking, the patterns were everywhere. Large transfers Emily never mentioned. Credit cards opened in her name. A home equity line she hadn't knowingly signed. Sandra arrived in a navy pantsuit at 9:15 carrying a leather briefcase and the kind of calm that doesn't come from optimism, but experience. She read silently for nearly an hour. Then she removed her glasses. "Diane," she said carefully, "this is bigger than abuse." My stomach dropped. Richard hadn't just controlled my daughter emotionally. He had been using her financially. Hidden debt, manipulated signatures, asset shielding. And Patricia, sweet, polished Patricia with her holiday centerpieces and pearl bracelets, had co-signed one of the shell accounts. I actually laughed then. Not because it was funny, because sometimes betrayal becomes so enormous your body rejects it as grief and processes it as disbelief. When Emily finally came downstairs, pale and exhausted, Sandra didn't overwhelm her. She simply said, "You are not crazy. You are not weak. And you are not trapped." I watched something happen in my daughter's face then. Not healing. Not yet. But recognition. Like someone had finally handed her the correct map after years of being told she was lost. By noon, emergency protective filings were underway. By 1, Sandra's forensic accountant was reviewing every account Richard touched. By 2, we discovered he had quietly positioned himself to refinance my daughter's inherited property from her father. My late husband's lake cottage. The one Emily was supposed to own outright. That was the moment this stopped being survival and became war. Because Richard hadn't only tried to diminish my daughter. He had reached for something my husband built for her with his own hands. Something sacred. Sandra closed her folder. "Oh," she said, her voice colder now. "He picked the wrong family." And for the first time since that dinner began. So had I. Richard arrived at my house at 4:43 that afternoon. Not alone. Patricia was with him, of course. Because women like Patricia never let their sons face consequences without bringing the architect of their entitlement along for support. I saw them through my front window before they even reached the porch. Richard in an expensive gray suit, jaw tight, trying to look composed. Patricia beside him in cream slacks and oversized sunglasses, as though appearing polished could somehow disguise panic. Emily froze in the kitchen. Her coffee cup actually rattled against the saucer. Sandra, however, barely glanced up from her notes. "Good," she said calmly. "Let them come." The knocking started sharp, then louder, then Richard's voice. "Emily, open the door. This has gone far enough." Funny, isn't it? How men always say that only when women finally stop enduring. I opened the door just enough to step outside, then closed it firmly behind me. Patricia's smile was immediate. Artificial. The same brittle social club smile she'd probably used while ruining PTA meetings and charity boards for 30 years. "Oh, Diane," she sighed, clutching her handbag dramatically. "This misunderstanding has gotten completely out of hand." Misunderstanding. There it was again. Their favorite word for deliberate harm. Behind her, Richard tried a softer approach. "Please. I just want to talk to my wife." I folded my arms. "No," I said. "You want access." His face changed then. Just for a second. The mask slipped. Sandra opened the front door behind me at precisely the right moment, holding a manila folder. "Richard Carter?" she asked. He blinked. "Yes. You've been formally advised not to contact Emily directly pending protective review. Also, any attempt to access, transfer, refinance, or leverage property tied to the Fairfield Lake estate is now legally frozen." Silence. Real silence. The kind that strips power from people who thought money and intimidation were interchangeable. Patricia's sunglasses came off. "What?" Sandra handed him the paperwork. "You forged financial leverage through coercive representation," she said evenly. "And your mother's account activity is now part of discovery." For the first time since I'd met Patricia, she looked old. Not elegant. Not commanding. Just old. Richard's voice cracked. "Emily wouldn't do this." And from inside my house, quiet, shaky, but clear, my daughter finally answered. "No, Richard," she said. "I didn't." He turned toward the sound of her voice like a man expecting weakness. What he found instead was Emily standing in my hallway, holding copies of every bank statement, every forged document, every hidden loan. "I just finally learned how much you already did." Patricia grabbed her son's arm. "Say nothing." Smartest thing she'd taught him yet. Because as Sandra stepped forward and handed over one final notice, I realized dinner had only been the beginning. They hadn't come to reclaim Emily. They had come to see whether she was still afraid. And when that door closed in their faces, they got their answer. After Richard and Patricia left my porch, the house felt strangely still. Not peaceful, but different. Like the air itself had shifted. For years, Emily had lived inside Richard's version of reality. His rules, his explanations, his carefully edited truth. But once someone sees the full blueprint of their own manipulation, they can never quite unsee it. That evening, Sandra stayed for dinner. Nothing fancy. Tomato soup, grilled cheese. The kind of simple meal I used to make when Emily was little and heartbreak could still be soothed with warm bread and a clean blanket. Only this heartbreak required paperwork. Emily sat at my kitchen table, her sleeves rolled down again out of habit, though for the first time, I noticed she wasn't hiding. She was thinking. Sandra spread out copies of financial statements, legal timelines, and property records with the precision of someone rebuilding a shattered mirror piece by piece. And then came the hardest part. Emily, Sandra said gently, I need you to tell me when you first realized Richard was making decisions without your consent. Consent. Such an important word. My daughter stared at her tea for so long I wondered if she'd answer at all. Then quietly, the honeymoon. I actually stopped breathing. Not because I was shocked Richard was cruel, but because I suddenly understood how early cruelty had arrived. Emily explained how he'd pressured her into merging accounts during their honeymoon in Napa. Said it was what mature couples do. How Patricia praised him for taking charge. How small objections became accusations. You don't trust your husband? Why are you being difficult? Do you want marriage or independence? Question by question, boundary by boundary, until surrender started sounding like love. Then came the isolation. Friends Richard said were bad influences. Jobs he claimed were too stressful for her. My weekly calls shortened by convenient excuses. And every time Emily hesitated, Patricia was there. Not with bruises. With philosophy. A smart wife knows when peace matters more than pride. I closed my eyes when I heard that. Because poison given gently can still destroy a woman. By the end of the night, Sandra's legal pad was full. Coercive control. Financial fraud. Emotional abuse. Witness corroboration. But mine? Mine was full of something else. Moments. Missed signs. Ignored instincts. The 1,000 tiny ways mothers blame themselves when they realize their child has been drowning politely. Emily reached for my hand then. Mom, she whispered, tears finally slipping free. He didn't break me all at once. I squeezed her fingers. I knew. That's never how people like Richard operate. They do it slowly. So slowly you confuse disappearing with adapting. And as I looked at my daughter, bruised, exhausted, but finally telling the truth, I realized this chapter was no longer about proving what Richard had done. It was about teaching Emily something Patricia never wanted her to learn. Leaving is not failure. Sometimes, leaving is the first honest thing a woman does. By Friday morning, Richard's world had begun to crack. Not collapse. Not yet. Men like Richard rarely fall all at once. First, they lose control of the narrative. And Sandra made sure of that. At 8:30 a.m., emergency court filings were submitted. Protective review. Temporary financial injunction. Exclusive access restrictions on Emily's inherited assets. By 10 o'clock, Richard's personal banker had been notified that all activity involving the lake cottage required forensic verification. By noon, Patricia's cozy little co-signed shell account was under investigation too. For the first time, their polished life wasn't being admired. It was being examined. Emily sat beside me in Sandra's office wearing one of my old navy cardigans, her hair pulled back, no makeup hiding the fading mark on her wrist. She looked exhausted, but she also looked visible. Sandra slid a document across the mahogany desk. Emergency occupancy petition, she said. If approved, Richard may be legally removed from the marital residence, pending review. Emily blinked. That can happen. Sandra's expression didn't change. Oh, sweetheart, she said. Men like him count on women never asking that question. I almost smiled. Not because any of this was easy, but because I could practically hear Patricia's generation trembling at the idea of women discovering options. Then Richard made his mistake. He sent flowers. White roses. Emily's favorite. With a handwritten note. Let's not destroy our family over one misunderstanding. I watched my daughter read it twice. 3 days ago she might have cried, apologized, questioned herself. Instead, she handed it to Sandra, who immediately placed it in an evidence folder. Because context changes everything. Flowers after intimidation aren't romance. their strategy. By that afternoon, Emily gave her formal statement. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just truthfully, about the wrist grabbing, the financial pressure, the humiliation, the years of being reduced so gradually she barely noticed herself vanishing. And when she finished, there was silence. The sacred kind. The kind that follows truth when it no longer needs defending. Then Sandra asked one final question. Mrs. Carter, do you want to go back? Emily didn't hesitate. No, such a small word. 2 letters. But I swear, I felt generations shift when she said it. Because Patricia had taught her to endure. Richard had taught her to fear consequences. But that morning, my daughter finally learned what freedom sounded like in her own voice. And by sunset, when the judge approved temporary protections, Richard wasn't just losing his wife. He was losing access to the life he built by convincing her she had nowhere else to go. The court hearing was set for Tuesday. For days. That's all it took for 27 months of manipulation to finally meet documentation. Richard arrived looking exactly like men like him always do when consequences become public. Tailored navy suit, conservative tie, expression carefully rehearsed somewhere between wounded husband and misunderstood professional. Patricia, naturally, wore pearls. Of course she did. Some women treat courtrooms the same way they treat country clubs, just another place to perform respectability. But truth has a way of making costumes look flimsy. Emily sat beside Sandra, hands trembling at first, until Sandra quietly placed a legal pad in front of her with one sentence written across the top. You are here to tell the truth, not protect him. I watched my daughter read that line 3 times. Then something inside her settled. Richard's attorney tried first. Mrs. Carter, would you say your husband was under unusual financial stress? Translation? Can we excuse cruelty if we dress it up as pressure? Emily answered softly. No, I'd say he was comfortable being cruel when no one was watching. Even Sandra glanced at her then. Not because it was dramatic, because it was precise. Patricia, however, couldn't help herself. She interrupted twice. Once to call Emily emotionally fragile. Once to suggest I had manipulated my own daughter. The judge was not impressed. Turns out, silver hair and a calm voice can still be powerful when attached to facts. Then came the bank records, the forged leverage attempts, the hidden debt structures, the shell account, Patricia's signature. I will never forget the moment her attorney stopped speaking mid-sentence. Not because he was confused, because there are only so many elegant ways to say, your client appears financially complicit. Richard's composure cracked first. Patricia's cracked worst. By recess, emergency occupancy protections were upheld. Emily retained temporary control of marital residence review. Richard was ordered to cease direct contact. And Patricia? Let's just say her social calendar was about to become significantly less crowded. Outside the courthouse, reporters weren't waiting. This wasn't that kind of scandal. But consequences do not need headlines to be devastating. Sometimes the deepest humiliation is quieter than that. A country club friend refusing eye contact. A board resignation. A frozen account. A son realizing his mother can't fix this one. As we walked down those courthouse steps, Emily paused. The sunlight caught her face in a way I hadn't seen in years. Not because she was suddenly healed, but because fear was no longer making all her decisions. Mom, she said, her voice shaky but clear, I think. I can breathe. I squeezed her hand. Yes, I said. That's what freedom feels like at first. Not victory. Not peace. Just air. And after years of surviving someone else's storm, air was more than enough to begin. 3 months later, Emily planted rosemary beneath the old white fence at the lake cottage. Her father's cottage. The one Richard had nearly leveraged. The one Patricia had treated like an asset. The one my late husband had built board by board with his own hands, promising our daughter she would always have one place in this world no one could take from her. Spring had finally come to Connecticut, soft and slow. The kind that doesn't arrive dramatically, just steadily enough that one morning, you realize the ground survived winter after all. I watched from the porch as Emily knelt in the garden wearing jeans, work gloves, and one of her father's faded Yale sweatshirts. Her wrist had healed. The bruise was gone. But more importantly, so was that flinch. That constant instinct to apologize before speaking. That terrible habit of making herself smaller. Sandra had finalized the divorce terms 2 weeks earlier. Financial restitution. Protected inheritance. Full separation. Richard's reputation, it turned out, had not survived forensic accounting nearly as well as his tailored suits. And Patricia? Well, even country clubs have limits when fraud becomes tedious. Emily looked up at me then, sunlight catching in her hair, and smiled. Not the careful smile. Not the practiced one. Her real smile. The one I hadn't seen in years. Mom, she called, brushing dirt from her hands. Where do you think Dad would have wanted the bench? I swallowed hard. Because grief is a strange thing. Sometimes it returns not as pain, but as proof that love still built something stronger than damage. By the water, I said. So he could see you stayed. Emily nodded. Stayed. Not in abuse. Not in fear. Stayed in herself. That summer, she turned the cottage into a counseling retreat for women rebuilding after coercive relationships. Just weekends at first. Tea. Legal workshops. Quiet mornings by the lake. Safe space. She called it Second Sundays. I cried the first time I saw the sign. Because Patricia had applauded when my daughter was diminished. But now, women were arriving to watch her rise. And sometimes, when the evening light hit the lake just right, I'd think back to that dinner. The crystal glasses. The broken bracelet. The applause. They thought that night was about power. They were wrong. It was about exposure. Because the moment Richard raised his hand, and Patricia clapped, they mistook a mother's silence for helplessness. What they failed to understand was that I wasn't freezing. I was choosing. Choosing precision over panic. Truth over appearances. My daughter over their performance. And if I've learned anything at 68, it's this. Family is not the people who demand your suffering to keep their comfort. Family is who helps you remember your name after someone tried to erase it. So when people ask how Emily survived, I tell them the truth. She didn't just survive. She came home. And this time, she stayed.